All right. Welcome, everyone. This is the December edition of the First Wednesday Lecture Series. I'm Ben Woodbury with the New Mexico History Museum's Friends of History, and we'll be your host today. If you wish to find out more on the Friends, please check out our website provided at the bottom of this video screen. Before introducing today's speaker, I want to announce next month's lecture. On Wednesday, January 6th, 2021, Dave DeWitt, the noted chili pepper expert, will discuss his new book, Chili Peppers, A Global History. I'm sure the talk will warm you up during the dark of winter. Now, for today's speaker. On this 100th anniversary year of the passage of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, we're fortunate to have with us Cathleen D. Cahill, Associate Professor of History at Penn State University, and previously on the faculty of the University of New Mexico. She will address us on Recasting the Vote, how women of color transformed the suffrage movement. Dr. Cahill's book of the same name has just been published by the University of North Carolina Press. As well, she is the author of Federal Fathers and Mothers, A Social History of the United States Indian Service from 1863 to 1933. This book was the winner of the 2011 La Briola Center American Indian National Book Award and finalist for the 2012 David J. Weber Clements Prize, presented each year by the Western History Association. After this presentation, there will be a live Q&A. We will hold this on YouTube. However, at the conclusion of the Q&A, the presentation and the Q&A will be published and available for further viewing on both Facebook and YouTube. With that, we welcome Dr. Cahill.
Thank you so much, Ben. That was a wonderful introduction, and I'm really excited to be with you, if only virtually, today. I miss New Mexico, and I'm delighted to have an opportunity to at least engage with folks there. So as you said, this is a talk drawn from my new book, Recasting the Vote. And what I thought I would do is focus especially on the New Mexico aspects today, given the the venue. So I'm going to focus particularly on New Mexico, but I think you'll see that New Mexico is a great microcosm of a lot of what was happening in the suffrage struggle, particularly for women of color. So I want to start with a New Mexico suffrage fact. According to historian Joan Jensen, whom I owe a lot to, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, or NASA, which was the main suffrage organization in the country, had 2 women on its 1910 subscription list for New Mexico. One was recorded as dead, and the other was listed as being a resident of a Silver City tuberculosis sanatorium. Now, just 1 decade later, New Mexico would become the 32nd state to ratify the 19th Amendment. So I want to sort of pose the question of what happened in that decade, right, where there's really no national suffrage presence to speak of, to becoming a major reason the amendment is ratified. Well, I argue that suffrage couldn't have been a success in New Mexico without the cooperation of Spanish-speaking women. But as we'll see today, also, despite New Mexico being a place where there was cooperation between women of different groups, particularly Anglo and Hispanic, there was still the pall of racial prejudice that marred other sections of the country, but also took on a unique kind of valence in New Mexico. So let me just give you a small illustration. I apologize for the quality of this photo. It was the only one I could download, but it's in the UNM archives, digital archives. So what you'll see here is a parade in Silver City in 1911, and it is quite possible that the NASA member who had been listed might still have been there when the Cottage Tuberculosis Sanatorium decorated this float for the parade. It's a float that's mocking suffrage. The people you see on the float are actually men dressed as women, holding a sign demanding votes for women. And newspapers said this was the float that drew the, quote, one good laugh of the day. Now, you'll notice, sort of, that the men also carry a sign that states Bullock's Indians, and it's referencing Dr. Bullock, who was the head of that sanatorium, and also suggesting an increasingly familiar trope that linked suffragists with, quote, wild Indian women, right? And this was a critique that suggested that white suffragists were unwomanly and violent. And it's an example of how anti-suffragists often portrayed women. But it also tells us that race was often in people's minds when they talked about women's suffrage, and we're going to come back to that. So more broadly, most suffrage stories and suffrage history centers in the East, and the Southwest is an afterthought at best. But I think we should ask what happens when we refocus our lens in New Mexico and the wider region. And again, as I said, we'll see that New Mexico is in some ways really unique, but it offers a great example of the diversity of experiences among women around the question of suffrage and voting rights, and especially the way in which 1920 and the ratification of the 19th Amendment really was different for women of different racial and ethnic groups. So I'm going to start our story in 1910, but for an excellent discussion of how Native people approached the question of voting, I want to recommend Maurice Crandall's new book, These People Have Always Been a Republic, and he looks specifically at New Mexico and Arizona. So in 1910, as you may know, New Mexicans were in the midst of a bid for statehood and were busily creating a new constitution for their state. This is what the US Census for that year determined in terms of the state's population, and you can see the majority of them were Hispanos or Nuevo Mexicanos. Now, most of them were people who had descended from folks who had been made US citizens through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. But let's remember that that treaty didn't include Native Americans, even though they had formerly been Mexican citizens, or in the year or two after that. Instead, the U.S. Came to treat them as it did other indigenous nations, as domestic dependent nations. And that status was changing. So after the Civil War, by 1871, the United States stopped signing treaties with Native nations, and in fact stopped recognizing their governments and asserted that Native people were now legally wards of the federal government. So a legal ward means you're on par with children or the mentally ill, right? You don't have the ability to make decisions about your own decisions, right? You don't have that independence. The government also began to institute a policy of assimilation that included outlawing numerous cultural traditions, dividing tribally held land into individual parcels, and creating a series of boarding schools that removed Native children from their families. So that's what was happening in New Mexico and across the country. Going back to the Hispanic population, while the arrival of the railroads in New Mexico in the 1880s did bring in more Anglos, Spanish speakers maintained a demographic advantage and a political advantage as well. Certainly through statehood in 1912 and even after. But the rest of the country had its reservations about this population. It was seen as, quote, too foreign and too Catholic. And in 1910, Congress had stated in the Enabling Act that it would allow New Mexico to submit a constitution, that it should be in English only. There should be English only provisions. So the office holders had to be proficient in English, and that schools should be English only. So that's sort of the bigger context in New Mexico at the turn of the century, when the question of women's suffrage was becoming more and more prominent. And in fact, suffrage, language, and religion were all questions addressed at the state constitutional convention, and Spanish-speaking women played a role in these debates along with Anglo women. So one of those women was Nina Otero Warren. You probably have heard of her. She was from a prominent political family. Her uncle, Miguel Otero, had been appointed territorial governor by President McKinley. I'm sorry, her cousin. And her maternal uncle, Solomon Luna, was a major player in politics, including at the Constitutional Convention. But her family still felt the effects of US takeover and the dispossession and sometimes violence that came with it. So her father, for example, had been murdered in a land dispute when she was a young girl. And her stepfather later received political position in the state government and moved the family to Santa Fe, which was the center of state politics. Another Nueva Mexicana involved in these debates was Aurora Lucero, who was the daughter of a newspaper editor and politician, Antonio Lucero. And he would soon become the first Secretary of State in New Mexico. At the time of the Constitutional Convention, though, she was a young college student at the New Mexico Normal School in Las Vegas, and she gave that year a winning speech called "Shall the Spanish Language Be Taught in the Schools of New Mexico?" or, as the Spanish papers reported it, "Defensa de Nuestro Idioma." And it was a direct response to that Congressional Enabling Act. And it powerfully argued for the importance of Spanish language, culturally and politically, not just in New Mexico, but nationally. And this was reprinted across the state and even into, the territory, and even into El Paso. And she's credited by historians as influencing legislators who were writing the Constitution. And indeed, they made sure to include protections for Spanish language rights and freedom of religion to protect their Catholicism in the new Constitution. So I want to look at this language for a minute. As you can see in the first bolded section, the right to vote, hold office, or sit in juries, they really directly reject the English-only language of the Enabling Act and emphasize that that shouldn't be denied on the basis of race, language, religion, color, or inability to speak or write English or Spanish, right? So these are powerful protections. However, this does say, except as may otherwise provided in this Constitution. And in that, they mean two things in particular. The first is that Indians not taxed, so Native people who lived on reservations, were excluded from the executive franchise. Also, women's voting was limited in the Constitution. The men writing the Constitution had considered women's suffrage, and in fact had been lobbied by the New Mexico Federation of Women's Clubs. That organization had just come together and federated in 1909, and many of its members across the state were Anglo women, but particularly in Santa Fe, there were a number of Hispanas as well. And they lobby for suffrage, but the men of the convention ultimately only included school suffrage. And even this was contingent. Women could vote for members of school boards and state superintendent of education, and they could run for those offices, but these were in separate elections. And if the majority of male voters in a county decided that they did not want women to vote, they could petition, and a simple majority would result in that right being taken away. So this section here protects the rights of Spanish-speaking men to vote. And then, as you can see in the second bolded part, makes that section extremely hard to change, extremely difficult to amend. 3/4 of the electors in the whole state and 2/3 of those in each county would have to vote for an amendment to change this part of the Constitution. So that's an extremely high bar. And it meant that the fight for women's suffrage in New Mexico was really stymied at the state level. And again, the primary federal the primary national organization pushing for women's suffrage, NASA, had a strategy of trying to make the change state by state at this point. So there's little there to help New Mexico women. That changes in 1913, however, when a young activist named Alice Paul, who had spent time in England with the radical British suffragettes, returned to the United States and wanted to revive the idea of pushing for a federal constitutional amendment. And she, picture of Nina Otero Warren. Alice Paul famously announces her strategy in 1913 with the first national protest parade in Washington, D.C. The women marched down Pennsylvania Avenue with this float that you see here on the left, demanding a constitutional amendment. And they do it the day before President Woodrow Wilson's inauguration to sort of make a splash. And it was said that every state was represented in this march. I haven't found evidence of actual New Mexican women who might have been in the march, though it's possible that women connected to the congressional delegation or otherwise in Washington were there. But you can certainly see that the other Western states were represented. Now, Alice Paul, after this parade, organizes a group, suffrage organization that becomes known as the Congressional Union and later the National Women's Party. And their strategy is a federal amendment. And when they came to New Mexico to recruit women to be part of the National Women's Party, they found New Mexican women really open to this strategy because it was the only way that they could gain suffrage, right, by overriding the state constitution. And again, both Nina Otero Warren and Aurora Lucero become leaders in this. And more than that, they emphasized that suffrage could not succeed in New Mexico without suffrage organizers reaching out to Spanish-speaking women, right? And again, the National Women's Party organizers were generally open to this. Only one of them was not. And one of the New Mexican women wrote, quote, "She was a Texas Democrat and should not have come into a Republican state." This is phrased in terms of politics, but it also suggests that the white supremacist leaning of Southern Democrats at the time might have been a concern. We'll come back to that. And indeed, New Mexicans were very wary of the expansion of Jim Crow laws that had segregated and disenfranchised African Americans and Mexican Americans in their neighboring state of Texas. So again, the early National Women's Party organizers wisely incorporated Spanish speakers like Warren and Lucero into the cause. And in 1915, the National Women's Party sent a woman named Ella St. Clair Thompson to New Mexico. And despite being from South Carolina, she harbored no prejudice against Spanish-speaking women. In fact, she spoke Spanish herself, quote, "very little, but it helps a lot," she wrote to Alice Paul. And working together, especially with Aurora Lucero, they printed literature in Spanish and emphasized topics such as child welfare that they believed would appeal to Spanish-speaking women. And she often encouraged Spanish speakers at the suffrage meetings. So she wrote to Alice Paul, quote, "They say it is very difficult to get the Spanish ladies out, but as I have one on the program to speak in Spanish, I think they will come, and their husbands as well." And she was right. That was a good strategy. So in October of 1915, when Thompson was visiting, the women of Santa Fe organized a suffrage parade. They wanted, they said, to, quote, "make a public act of faith in the cause of women's suffrage." And about 150 women joined this parade. There were Anglo women and Hispanic women. Some of them rode in automobiles. Mrs. Trinidad Cabeza de Vaca, whose family owned one of the first cars in the cities, lent hers to this cause. And there were a number of other Hispanic women, many of whom had family connections to politicians and office holders in the cities. So Mrs. James Chavez, Aurora Lucero, Mrs. Segundino Romero, Arabella Romero, and her daughter Marie. Also marching that day was Lola Armijo. She was the first female member of the state government. She was appointed state librarian in 1912. And the governor had actually tried to replace her with a man, arguing that under the state constitution, women couldn't be elected to office, but a court upheld her appointment. So all of those women were there. Nina Otero Warren doesn't seem to have been there, and I don't know why, but I suspect she just was out of town. So the marchers basically made a big figure 8 throughout the city. They began on the plaza. They went around south, circling the state capitol building. Then they came back through the plaza before going north and circling around the federal building. And then they ended their march at the house of U.S. Senator Thomas Catron. And the newspapers said that hundreds of people were out to watch this. So Senator Catron was a notorious anti-suffragist. And they knew they had to appeal to him, though they were not very optimistic about their chances. They had 4 women designated as speakers, 2 Anglo and 2 Hispanic, and the latter 2 were Aurora Lucero and Arabella Romero. Lucero said it was a real pleasure to, quote, speak for the Spanish American women who, while conservative, want the best possible laws when their home life is the question at issue. And she expressed confidence that the senator would support the amendment. But he declined and then went on to lecture the women at great length as to why they were wrong to demand the vote. He had listened politely to their speeches, but then used a series of familiar anti-suffragist arguments. Women and men were too different. Women weren't suited to politics. Being in politics desexed women. He pointed to anti-suffragist women to say, most women don't really want the vote. And on, right? There were biblical reasons. He has a whole list. Thompson describes him as, quote, an awfully cross old thing, end quote, but again, they had to try. Another significant question that the senator raised was the issue that his congressional colleagues from the South were concerned about. And you can see here from the same moment an anti-suffrage card from the state of Georgia. What, he asked, about Black women who might get the vote and disrupt social relations in the South? And here Thompson responded in a way that white suffragists often responded. And again, they're doing this in New Mexico as well. And she said Black women wouldn't be a problem. Quote, there was no danger of the Negro complicating the situation because Southern state laws that disenfranchised Black men would apply to Black women too. And again, this was generally the position of those larger national organizations, kind of letting states decide that on the basis of their own laws. And they hoped that this would win the support of Southern state legislators and congressmen, though it generally didn't. This was certainly a stance that would not have been reassuring to the Black women of New Mexico. So in 1917, the next year, another organizer came, national organizer from the National Women's Party, and the purpose of her visit was to establish an official New Mexican branch of the National Women's Party. They were going to hold a big meeting to adopt a constitution, elect officers, and again, Spanish speakers and Hispanic women are there. So, for example, Mona Baca, who was the daughter of R.I. Baca, the state speaker of the House, was selling suffrage pins at this meeting. Aurora Lucero was soliciting subscriptions to the National Women's Party journal called The Suffragist. And Dolores and Rosina Berger, who are Nina Otero Warren's half-sisters, were working as ushers. So they're very involved here. In electing officers, the women of the state chose Nina Otero Warren to be vice chair of the state organization. And when the chair, Sarah Reynolds of Albuquerque, stepped down about a year later, Alice Paul asked Nina Otero Warren to fill that position. And she agreed. She wrote to Paul, quote, I am with you now and always. So she becomes the leader of the state suffrage organization. She's also extremely busy with her own work. The New Mexico Board of Education had appointed her interim superintendent of schools for Santa Fe County. And the next year she actually runs for that position and campaigns, winning over a male opponent. And this was her first experience campaigning, but it proves to observers that she was up to the challenge, which would become important later. And she holds this position for the next 12 years. 1917 is also a year that New Mexico sends Democrat A.A. Jones to Congress, to the Senate, where he was made chair of the Women's Suffrage Committee for the Senate. And until that committee voted on the language of the proposed constitutional amendment and passed it out of their committee, it wasn't going anywhere. So New Mexico's senator, one of their senators, plays a really key role here. The Albuquerque Journal found this assignment, committee assignment, extremely amusing, and they ran the headline, quote, new senator to become most popular gentleman in Washington with workers for the Anthony Amendment, as it was often called, named after Susan B. Anthony. So Jones brings with him to Washington his campaign interpreter, a young Dennis Chavez, And Chavez becomes clerk in the Senate while going to night school at Georgetown University. And Dennis Chavez brought with him his wife, Yamelda Espinoza Chavez, and she also gets a government job. She begins working in the Commerce Department. And so all of them, these New Mexicans, have a front row seat to the climactic battle to get the National Amendment passed through Congress. As chair of the Women's Suffrage Committee, Jones is really at the center of it, and he's often lobbied by Nassau's lobbyist, Maud Wood Park, who goes on to become the first president of the League of Women Voters. Nina Otero Warren also lobbies Jones from New Mexico and sometimes traveled to Washington, D.C. to meet with National Women's Party members and her delegation. So during the war, the National Women's Party becomes notorious for picketing the White House and criticizing President Wilson. But other suffrage organizations, such as Nassau, really emphasize women's war work and patriotism and make that an argument for suffrage. And even though the women in New Mexico are affiliated with the National Women's Party, they actually began to work in these war efforts as well. Nina Otero Warren was heavily involved in this. She helps form the New Mexico Auxiliary of the National Council of Defense, which was run by Anna Howard Shaw and Herbert Hoover. And Anna Howard Shaw was the former president of Nassau. And Aurora Lucero is also doing quite a bit of this work as well. She holds sort of fruit drying demonstrations on the Santa Fe Plaza. After her brother, Antonio Lucero Jr., enlisted in the Navy, she volunteers with the women's section of the Navy League. So many of these suffragists are volunteering in this war work, but also remain engaged in suffrage work. In 1919, the House of Representatives passes the amendment, and the Senate follows in June of 1919. And New Mexico's suffragists were very proud that their congressional delegation all voted for the amendment. And at that point, it goes out to the states who will have to ratify it. Although suffrage organizations were nonpartisan, Nina Otero Warren anticipated that women would soon be enfranchised, and she actually moves out of the suffrage organization and into party politics. And the men in her family were powerful Republican leaders in the state, and she joins them in the ranks of the party, becoming New Mexico's GOP state chair of New Mexico's GOP State Women's Committee. In 1920, she helps open a headquarters for the Republican women near the Santa Fe Plaza. And she is anticipating that New Mexico is going to ratify the amendment and again start focusing on women's suffrage and women registering women to vote and getting them involved right away. But she's continuing to work for state ratification. So she's doing both. And in February of 1920, the special session of the legislature is called to consider this. New Mexican women felt pretty confident about this initially, but right at the last moment, it seems like some of the Republicans in particular are going to bolt and not vote to ratify. And Nina Otero Warren has to really redouble her efforts, and she's really leading the charge. She is in sort of conference with the Republican leadership. She's working with them to round up those members. And then in February 17th, 1920, this advertisement appears in the Santa Fe New Mexican. I don't know if Nina Otero Warren is involved in it, but it's interesting. And I want to bring us back to this question again of sort of race more broadly in the United States. So this advertisement holds up Texas and other southern Jim Crow states as the opposite of New Mexico, right? And it suggests that race prejudice, which was resulting in those states voting against suffrage or being anti-suffrage, would hurt Spanish-speaking women, right? And what's interesting about this is Texas had actually already ratified the 19th Amendment, though white suffrage leaders had made the case that the amendment was really going to enfranchise white women. And they contrasted that with immigrants in Texas, immigrant men, especially German Americans and Mexican Americans, and argued that white women's suffrage would sort of counter those votes. So in New Mexico, whoever was advocating for women's suffrage was drawing a contrast between the state of Texas and the state of New Mexico, and arguing that New Mexico needed to advocate for women's suffrage because in particular it helped Spanish-speaking women, although they kind of just abandon the Black women in the state, right? Is the opposition afraid to give the ballot to the 100 or 2 Negro women resident in New Mexico? So because of Nina's sort of last minute efforts and the Republican Party's push, New Mexico, as I said, becomes the 32nd state to ratify the 19th Amendment. And this was extremely important because the amendment needed ultimately 36 states to ratify it. As New Mexico women watched over the next few months, it moved very slowly towards the next 4 and came down, in fact, to a single vote in the Tennessee House. So without New Mexico and without the efforts of Spanish-speaking women like Nina Otero Warren and Aurora Lucero, it may well not have been ratified. So in New Mexico, this news was met with celebration. Whistles and bells sounded, women hung flags outside their houses and wore flag pins, but they also knew that the election was just a few months away. So Tennessee ratifies in August of 1920, and there is an election in November. So they quickly set up suffrage schools that will help women understand how to register to vote, what the issues are, and kind of go through the actual process. Some women insisted on being nonpartisan. So here's a headlines about these women's club classes for how to register to vote, what that process is going to be like. Here is sort of a nonpartisan women's party that was advocating for the election in 1920 and how women should be involved. You'll notice it's also bilingual. But a lot of women moved quickly into the party structures. So Mrs. A.B. Strupp of Bernalillo County, who was the chair of the County Republican Women's Committee, was happy about the ratification of the amendment, but, quote, felt a sense of responsibility rather than a feeling of exultation because they were so close to the election. But she knew that the state Republican Women's Committee was in the hands of Nina Otero Warren, who already had, quote, plans for the work among the counties and precincts, which will enable us to organize rapidly. Now, lest you think it was only Republicans, Democrats also moved quickly to appeal to newly enfranchised women. The chair of the Democratic State Central Committee went to work hiring women who could serve as campaign speakers, and you see a couple itineraries here and lists of speakers. Mrs. Barrickman on the left was actually fired for not being a great speaker, but Frances Nixon over on the right was a veteran suffrage activist, one of the founders of the New Mexico Federation of Women's Clubs, and she was apparently a great speaker. So the chairman of the Democrat Speakers Bureau, for example, wrote to a man in Alamogordo, one of the coordinators in Alamogordo, saying, "We sincerely hope that everything is being done to interest the Democratic women voters of your country. The Republican women up this way are thoroughly interested, and every one of them will vote on election day. We must win this election, and the result can only be obtained by every Democratic woman voting on election day." So one of the first things that both parties address is, in part because they're catering to these new female voters, is the fact that the state constitution said that only men could hold political office. And each party supports changing this constitution, and there's a special election in 1921 where that happens. And it doesn't require the same high bar to change that portion of the Constitution as it did to change the voting section. So it passes. And in 1922, in that election, that off-year election, both parties run female candidates, again, continuing to court women. So let's see here. Oh, and this is from 1921, again, to sort of show how women were being courted in the papers. There are large sort of discussions about the role of women. There's sort of a kerfuffle about Senator Bursam, and women kind of come to his aid. All right. So in 1922, the Republicans nominate Nina Otero Warren as their candidate for congressional representative. She actually wins the primary against Nestor Montoya, who was the incumbent. And this is seen as a big deal across the nation. She gets news, she gets written up across the nation. As soon as she was nominated, she starts out on the campaign trail and uses her connections and her skills that she gained fighting for suffrage to run this campaign. The Democrats nominated Soledad Chavez de Chacon for Secretary of State. She was also part of an active political family, and in fact, Dennis Chavez was her cousin. And here's where these threads come back together. So Yamelda Chavez, Dennis Chavez's wife, and Soledad Chavez de Chacon were close friends and perhaps political planners. They were both members of the new League of Women Voters in Albuquerque. And when Soledad Chavez de Chacon won her election and became the first woman in the nation to be elected Secretary of State, and of course the first Hispanic woman or Latina woman to serve in statewide office, she took advantage of the fact that the Secretary of State was able to appoint the Assistant Secretary of State, and she wanted to appoint Yamelda Chavez. But Dennis Chavez didn't like the idea of his wife living in Santa Fe while he was in Albuquerque. And it seems that party leaders were a little wary about having these two women doing their thing. And they actually asked Soledad Chavez de Chacon's husband, Eduardo or Ed Chacon, to be the Assistant Secretary of State. So he becomes Assistant Secretary of State for her. But she's very successful, and she is renominated 2 years later to run again, and she wins. And she later runs for a state legislative seat and wins and becomes representative from Bernalillo County. So as the two main parties incorporate Anglo and Hispanic women really quickly into their structures, other women were left out. And actually, before I move on from the two main parties, I should say that Mrs. Cabeza de Vaca becomes very involved in the Progressive Party. She serves as New Mexico's committee woman for the National Progressive Party. So women are involved in many of the parties. But those are Anglo and Hispanic women, and other women are left out. And so I want to use the time I have left to think about those other women. So Black women in New Mexico were part of the club woman movement, but generally not the General Federation of Women's Clubs that were formed by Anglos and Hispanics. They had their own network, the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, and New Mexican women, certainly by the 1920s, were involved in this. They were also excited about voting in the election of 1920, but an incident in Columbus, New Mexico shows that they were vulnerable even in a state that was not part of the Jim Crow South. So soon after the election, there were allegations, these are some headlines and that kind of give us a sense of the multiple ways that women experienced 1920. So soon after the election of 1920, there were a number of allegations from Columbus, New Mexico, that election officials had refused to receive the votes from a number of African-American women who were the wives of soldiers stationed at the military base there. Newspaper articles said as many as 60 to 70 Black women had their votes rejected or were turned away. And this particularly became an issue in the local sheriff's race, where that number would have made a difference and flipped it from the Democratic candidate winning to the Republican candidate winning. And so it goes to court the second time. And the question turned on whether or not those women were residents because their husbands were in the military. So were they residents in New Mexico? And the New Mexico Constitution said that people who were either serving the federal government or the military right? So the civil service or in the military, didn't lose their residency in New Mexico, but also needed to sort of declare residency if they were in New Mexico, right? So if they were stationed elsewhere, they didn't lose it, but if they were in New Mexico, they needed to sort of absolutely demonstrate that they were residents. And the judge held that the soldiers in Columbus had not demonstrated to enough of an extent that they were residents of New Mexico, that they intended to take up residency there. He also ruled, and this is significant, that their wives, their condition followed that of their husbands. So if the heads of household, the male heads of household, had not stated that they would be residents of New Mexico, the women were not residents, right? So they couldn't make up their own political minds, essentially. And so he held that under the provisions of the 19th Amendment, the women did not acquire a separate residence from their constitution, and they lose the court case. So these women, these Black women's votes are thrown out. Also, as you recall from the opening anecdote, stereotypes about Native women were that they were uncivilized, right? And federal policy in this moment is focused on assimilation, and that Native people, the majority, are considered legal wards of the government, not citizens. And so in New Mexico, Native people are told that if they vote, it indicates that they have moved, right? They have given up their place in their tribal communities, and they're now US citizens, and it's an either or proposition. So many people in Pueblo communities didn't want to vote because they were afraid of losing particularly their lands and their rights to those lands, and of being sort of separated from their communities. But even if they had wanted to, they were not legally citizens. And so Native suffragists and other activists continue to push for this. And by 1924, Congress passes the Indian Citizenship Act, which extends US citizenship over all Native people, whether they want it or not, suggesting that they could vote. And many people were excited about this. Many Native people were excited about this. But as you see from the headline at the top of this page, not all residents of New Mexico or other Western states thought this was a great idea. There's the same kind of stereotypes about whether or not Native people are civilized enough, but also a lot of folks in Western states recognized that the populations of Native people were large enough in those places to really shape an election, right? Upwards of 10% in places like New Mexico, Arizona, the Dakotas, Montana, Oklahoma. And so many states move pretty quickly to make sure that they can't exercise that right to vote. So in New Mexico and Arizona in 1924, there are court cases to consider whether Native people living on Indian land on reservations can vote, and both states rule that no, under state constitution, that still means that they're wards of the government despite federal legislation. So Indians not taxed couldn't vote. And as you also may know, that in New Mexico, this remains the case until returning veteran Miguel Trujillo sues in 1948 to have this changed. And even then, in New Mexico, there are still some pockets, some state, some county laws that disenfranchise Native people. Other Western states use similar arguments or use laws that we think of as Southern Jim Crow laws, literacy tests, poll taxes, to keep Native people from voting, again, until after World War II, and sometimes not until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So even in a state like New Mexico, where Spanish-speaking women had opportunities to move into politics in ways that other women of color, including Mexican-American women in their neighboring states of Texas and Arizona, did not, there were still women in New Mexico who were disenfranchised. And while it's important that sometimes the arguments for their disenfranchisement were not explicitly race-based, the intent and the result was to target people of specific racial groups. So for example, in Columbus, it seems that it was African-American soldiers' wives who were specifically targeted. Native people, it was about their citizenship status, but the result is the disenfranchisement of Native people. So this is a reminder for us in the present that disenfranchisement can hurt all of us in a democracy. It's also a reminder that these struggles from the turn of the 20th century are issues that remain with us today as we see disenfranchisement, particularly, for example, of Native people under the question of can tribal ID be used as a voter ID. So again, New Mexico offers us this unique state where there was cooperation among women of different groups, Anglo women and Hispanic women, and New Mexico would not have passed women's suffrage and ratified the 19th Amendment without that cooperation. But at the same time, there was still disenfranchisement. And I hope that this, what I've talked about today, also reveals the real diversity of suffrage activism and suffrage conversations that changes the way we think about who was fighting for suffrage, who was involved in those conversations, and what it might have looked like. So thank you.
Thank you, Kathleen. Most helpful and informative. To our audience, I want to thank those who persisted. We did have some technical difficulties for which we apologize. But in the meantime, for those of you that stayed, I'm sure you found it most informative. We very much like, if you have any questions, to post them there on Facebook in the chat, and we will make every effort to get to those. In the meantime, Kathleen, I'll try to kick this off. And I was particularly intrigued by the history of Nina Otero Warren and the really extremely important role that she played, and how that in turn leveraged her having such an important position within the Republican Party even before the starting, showed the level of commitment that she had, and certainly as with the number of other women that you mentioned, really highlights the importance that women of color really played, not only in getting the state to approve that, but in terms of making every effort to make the transition for women to vote as important as it was. I didn't know whether you might have some additional comments you'd like to make in that regard to start us off.
Sure, thank you. And yeah, absolutely, right? I think New Mexico is a state that really demonstrates the importance of the diversity in the suffrage movement. It would not have been ratified in New Mexico without the Spanish-speaking suffragists, and especially Nina Otero Warren. I mean, she is just a force. And yeah, she is ready to be in politics sort of as soon as ratification happens. She actually resigns from her suffrage position in the National Women's Party, which was a nonpartisan position, and becomes the women's chair in the Republican Party. So from June 1919, right, she's already really jumped in. And again, it makes perfect sense because all of the men in her family, right, were exactly like that. And so she's following a family tradition. And she keeps going. And I'm now in Pennsylvania. I'm a lot closer to Washington, D.C. And one of the things I want to do is find out more about her later work, where she is in the 1930s and 40s appointed by Franklin Roosevelt, right? So a Democratic administration, to work in Puerto Rico, and particularly in bilingual education. So bilingualism and support of the Spanish language is a strong theme throughout her life and her political career. And I'm really curious about sort of that portion of her life. But she continues to be active in all sorts of things. She becomes an inspector of Indian schools in Santa Fe, so works for the federal government in the 1920s. And in that position, she later becomes a real estate agent in Santa Fe, a very successful one. And then, as I said, by the Roosevelt administration, she's doing work in Puerto Rico. And I think she's sort of an example of women who, Spanish-speaking women in New Mexico, like Aurora Lucero, who sort of makes these claims in that early speech in 1910, that Spanish is a really important language, that the U.S. needs to take advantage of the Spanish speakers in New Mexico in their sort of thinking about their position in the world, right? So diplomacy in Latin America, but also, of course, the U.S., the newest colonies, particularly Puerto Rico, which becomes a U.S. colony in the very end of the 19th century, 1898, and the Philippines, which are part of that. So both of those women are saying, look, Spanish is really important diplomatically, and New Mexico provides the U.S. with these, this real wealth of Spanish speakers. So they're thinking internationally, and they're thinking about how their state can really strengthen the U.S., which, again, there was a lot of concern about New Mexico coming in as a state because it was such a predominantly Spanish-speaking territory. So, her politics always encompass this defense of Spanish, and she, absolutely is really interested in kind of multiple ways of getting involved. And she's so busy. I mean, I didn't even mention all of the things she's doing while also being involved in this. I mean, she just volunteers for everything. It's exhausting, but she was apparently really good at being an organizer and kept getting asked. She's asked to lead the public health board in New Mexico. She's superintendent of schools for Santa Fe County. She does all kinds of volunteering during the war with the Red Cross, with the Catholic war effort. I mean, she's all over the place. So she's really impressive.
Right. And she lived a long and full life, dying in 1965. Mm-hmm. We have a few other questions from the chat. Mm-hmm. And to start with, following up on the discussion on Nina Tara Warren, what did Aurora Lucero do after the suffrage movement? Did she hold office or a business? She just seems an equally interesting person.
She is. She really is. So she is, as I said, a little bit younger than Nina Tara Warren. She starts off as a college student, and then she teaches. In 1917, she's teaching in Tucumcari at the high school there, and she's this head of the Spanish department. So again, her politics are also heavily, inflected with this idea of protecting the Spanish language and, expanding it or incorporating it. And she also is very involved in the suffrage activism, but she gets married in 1919. To an Anglo businessman from Denver. And it seems, or at least what those sources suggest, is that he becomes involved with business in Latin America. And they may have moved to Latin America for a few years. It's unclear. And then they come back to New Mexico after 1920. She runs for a position as superintendent of education in 1923, I think it is, but she doesn't win. But so she does sort of try and engage in electoral politics. And then, and I don't remember when, but at some point the first marriage falls apart, and she remarries. But with her, sort of the story is that she becomes very involved in the 1930s with the WPA, and is a teacher and does a lot of work of collecting sort of Spanish folk stories and folk songs. And so publishes a number of those through these WPA projects, and publishes throughout sort of the 30s and 40s, and I think into the 50s. And a lot of it is, again, this trying to chronicle the Spanish language heritage of New Mexico and preserve it, right? And Nina Tara Warren does a little bit of this as well, right? She writes an article in the Survey Graphic about New Mexico, and she publishes sort of a memoir of her childhood. And both of the women's writings get incorporated into sort of, the textbooks that children would use in elementary and high school, sort of early forms of kind of diversifying the literature that kids would read, and these short stories or portions of their work, go out across the nation and actually have I would say, a big impact. So both of them sort of dabble in this electoral politics. I shouldn't say dabble, that makes it sound too kind of frivolous, but they try. But it's actually really hard. There's an initial excitement about women winning the vote after 1920, and the parties kind of initially try to have female candidates, but they pretty quickly realize that women aren't voting in a major block like they thought they would. And so party leadership becomes less interested in making sure that they have female candidates. And so it's very hard for women to win these electoral offices moving forward after 1920. So I think both of those women are navigating that and kind of turn, especially, as I said, to ways in which they can celebrate and save those Spanish-speaking traditions in New Mexico. They both care very deeply about that. Nina Otero Warren's very involved in the fiesta, for example. So that becomes their politics, which again, might not sound political, but it is when you think about how the Spanish language was not appreciated by particularly, Anglos in the wider US.
In addition,
and I would just want to add, Aurora Lucero's, I think it's her grandson, is still around, and I believe still in New Mexico. I briefly corresponded with him. So, again, it's not that long ago this passed.
Yeah, wonderful. You've been very good, very helpful in terms of talking about how the Spanish women became part of active voting. You also provided a nice summary in terms of the Native American population and the challenges they faced to get the full vote. Could you comment in terms of the African American population here in New Mexico and how that fit in with the overall civil rights movement?
Sure. So that's something, the incident in Columbus didn't make it into my book. That's something that I more recently stumbled across. And the African-American population in New Mexico and in the West is pretty small overall, but they are politically active. And they are, as I said, part of this broader network of what was known as the Colored Women's Club movement. And so women, African-American women, I think there were only about 5,000 African-Americans in New Mexico at the time. But women in Albuquerque and, and then of course, Blackdom in Southern New Mexico are engaged in politics, are thinking about state politics and the position of African-Americans more broadly in the country. So in New Mexico, Black women get the right to vote in 1920, along with, everybody, all other women. And in a lot of Western states and Northern states, Black women get the right to vote, when those states enfranchise women. So in the West, most of the states, women can vote before 1920. And then kind of the North, that's mostly post 1920 with the ratification. The South, however, Black women, and they try to go to register and they try to participate, but they run up against those same Jim Crow laws. And the women in New Mexico are really aware of that as well. So that's, I think, partly why they get very frustrated with what happens in Columbus, because they know that elsewhere, Black women are being really deliberately disenfranchised, and New Mexico is not a state that had generally had, certainly doesn't have Jim Crow laws. So I'm really curious about that incident, and I would like to know more about it. So it's something that's kind of an ongoing interest of mine. But I definitely see, I've been collecting the names of some of the women who are going to these kind of regional conferences and are appearing in things like there's a Denver newspaper, African-American newspaper, that kind of covers regional issues. So they're hard to find, because the sources are limited, but they're not impossible to find.
Well, we look forward to your your essay or book on that subject. One final question. Of course, the Udall family is very important, particularly here in New Mexico, and you pointed out that Madge Udall was involved early on supporting the passage of the 19th Amendment approval here in New Mexico. Can you add anything more in terms of her activities?
I can't add much more, although she was extremely active, and exactly the picture of her in that suffrage parade in 1913. Women from the Western states, and when does Arizona get it? It might be 1912, might be with statehood. But so Arizona has women's suffrage before New Mexico. Again, all of the Western states from the mountainous West enfranchised women before 1920. So Udall is part of that. And then those women are often held up in the Eastern states as, right, here's an example of women voting, and, the world doesn't collapse. So we should do it too. It's interesting, I'm here in Pennsylvania, and in 1915, Pennsylvania votes on the question of women's suffrage in this state. And all of the pro-suffrage sort of paraphernalia, pamphlets and posters and things emphasize the Western states where women vote, right? So Arizona is always in there. And so when Udall comes back to the suffrage parade in Washington, right, she's representing women who are already voting. And again, the world hasn't collapsed. And in fact, people argued that those states were more progressive because women could vote in them. But again, New Mexico, because of that constitutional difficulty, it's the only state in the West that couldn't enfranchise women first.
Well, thank you, Kathleen. Give you one more moment if there's any last comments you'd like to make, and then we'll say farewell.
Yeah, no, I just really appreciate this. I love talking about New Mexico, and it really was because I lived in New Mexico, and people there know about, Nina Otero-Warren, everybody knows about her, but I realized that people outside the state didn't. And so it really was my inspiration to think about this book came out of, right, her story in a lot of ways. And then it grew from there. So I'm really grateful to everybody there that keeps New Mexico's history. And I'm really thrilled I got to be on the program today. So thank you.
Well, thank you. It was most informative, and I think quite worthwhile. To those who remained with us, and I noticed the audience that did come has stayed with us throughout this, and for which we appreciate. This entire presentation and the Q&A, as we mentioned earlier, will be available again on YouTube and on Facebook on the New Mexico History Museum pages, probably later this afternoon or tomorrow, and will be available for reference and additional viewing at that time. For those that are interested in reading further with Kathleen's book, a reminder that her book is available through the University of North Carolina Press, and the link was provided earlier. We can provide that as well. I recall that Kathleen, you mentioned one particular book on suffrage in the Southwest. I wonder if you might repeat that in case others would want to even broaden their reading interest.
Yeah, it's a great book. I'm actually going to mention two. So the one I mentioned is Maurice Crandall's These People Have Always Been a Republic. It's about Native people's relationship to suffrage from the Spanish. I think he starts in 1598 to 1912. It's great. He's a UNM grad, got his PhD there. And then the other book that folks might be interested in is Rosina Lozano's An American Language, The History of Spanish in the United States. And I'm really in debt to her, sort of thinking about the power of Spanish speakers in New Mexico, but also all of the states that come out of the Mexican Cession. And it's really interesting stuff. So lots of good work out there.
Well, thank you again. And then again, to our audience, just a reminder, we will be holding our January first Wednesday lecture on the 6th of that month. And David DeWitt will be speaking on chili peppers and talking about his global history in that book. For those that might be interested in other activities within the Friends of History, I point you to our friendsofhistory.org webpage. Please feel free to review that. There will also be additional information on the various talks we're doing and the walking tours when, in fact, those old Santa Fe historic tours are able to occur. There are also opportunities to join the Friends of History if you're interested, and to make donations in support of the Friends of History activities. Again, thank you all, and look forward to seeing you again in a month. Signing off.